What's up YouTube boxing family? It is Rod here. I'm back at it with another boxing video for y'all today. I'm going to be talking about this female fight that went down between these two girls by the name of Isis Seo, the one that you see to the left, that suffered a really brutal knockout loss to Jocelyn at the 115-pound division on the ProBoxTV fight card for Lester Martinez versus Emmanuel Alim. But before I get to that, be sure to like, rate, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, man, I definitely appreciate the real ones that that be supporting me. And yeah, I'm always happy to do what I do best. So yeah, let's talk about this, man. So this was a very tragical incident that could have definitely been a lot worse, to the point where nobody doesn't want to talk about the dark side of boxing. But I will say this as far as my particular point of view. This is my ultimate saying for any combat sport. The two most dangerous sports in the world that that you can't play. You can't play boxing and you can't play wrestling. Those are two sports where you will ultimately die if you decide to not focus on defense and focus on being being smart with what you do, because those two sports can easily take your life. But as far as the situation between Jocelyn Camarillo that you see to the right knocking out Isis Seo to the left, this is a very sad moment, because the thing was that I'm not going to put the blame on Jocelyn, because she's not she's not to be blamed for this. But I hate the double standards in boxing, where everybody wants to care about a fighter's health when they get brutally knocked out, but they don't hold that same other standard for fighters that have shed a lot of sacrifice to the sport, that have been beat up real bad, whether those are fighters that have been cheated or fighters that have gone to war with other great fighters and they are no longer the same fighter. And some examples that I can bring to this are Wilfredo Benitez. You can take a look at guys like I could take a look at guys like Billy Collins when he got cheated by Luis Resto, where he got beat up real bad, and he he wasn't able to see properly, and then I want to say he had some sort of brain injury as well, so then he ended up taking his own life, and then he died in a massive car accident. But I mean, there's plenty of fighters that I can just keep on going. Pritchard Colon, when he got done dirty by Terrell Williams, Terrell Williams should have been prosecuted for his crimes, but people want to just shrug that off to say, oh no, well Pritchard, he was doing some dirty stuff too, and Terrell Owens deserved that victory. Nah, bro. Boxing fans like to pick and choose who they want to pick when it comes to fighters that they like, and they use this to infatuate racial divide, to say that fighter should do that to that to that other fighter, because I don't want to hold that person accountable for their for their actions. So I just think it's really stupid. I think it's very idiotic and very evil. I think boxing needs to be a lot more stricter when it comes to how fights are being handled, whether fighters are cheating or whether they're coming in with tampered gloves, drugs, and also making sure that they're medically cleared too. Because I think honestly with this fight, I think the California State Athletic Commission did something really grimy, where they did not do their job. They just allowed Isis to come into this fight with having a lot of damage taken in her last fight, where she fought Perla Bazuwada, and she's that other Mexican Mexican girl that fights on Top Rank, but she's not known to knock people out, and she's not really known to really punch that hard. But with Isis, granted, I will say even though that she is 1-3, and she's been stopped 2 times, and she lost 1 fight by decision, she does take a lot of punishment, and she doesn't have the defensive mechanics fundamentally to move her head and actually be technical when she's fighting. She's fighting very one-dimensional, and she's leaving herself wide open to get hit. And granted, I understand, that's important, that people need to, focus on defense, when they are competing at that particular level for any fighter. But I think it's also due to the health of fighters not being cleared with how they're being properly evaluated leading up. Yeah, basically, how should I say, how they're being properly evaluated with their medical, track record leading up to, every fight, that they get into. So I think this is the fault of the California State Athletic Commission, and I think they should be federally, investigated, for what they do, because I don't know how every U.S. state doesn't get, how should I say, they don't get held to a certain standard of accountability to make sure that, American fighters that are competing in boxing, they are being screened properly to make sure that there's a proper health check background, a health check background screening procedure to make sure that both fighters are healthy coming into this fight, and there's no backdoor issue happening in terms of some faulty basically some faulty screening goes on with certain commissions that don't want to basically clear fighters to make sure that that they're basically coming in coming in stable, so they're not dealing with any medical issues, getting hurt in their fights. So that's just my personal opinion, but I just think this is just a really crappy commission that was being very irresponsible, and for stuff like this, this should not even happen. This should be a legal prosecution where this where the State Athletic Commission for California or any other U.S. state commission they should be sued. So that's just my personal opinion for that. But I would like to see sports screening to be held to a market competition, so therefore companies can properly do a right job to make sure that fighters get screened heading into fights. So therefore if that fighter has been knocked out 3+ times, and they should not be fighting until their body is fully healed and fully rested, so they're not taking any unnecessary damage, then I think, there should be, competitive business firms coming in to basically make sure that that fighter's not getting beat up too much. So therefore you don't see any particular issues where that fighter could possibly pass away because they got knocked out 3 to 4 times. And I personally thought this fight could have easily ended up like that one situation with the Mexican female fighter by the name of Jeanette Zacarias, Zapata, that passed away to that Canadian fighter, Mary Piojo. And, but the reason why she had passed away was simply because, in previous fights that she had leading up to that fight, she's been knocked out multiple times heading into that fight. So, previous, commissions did not screen her properly to basically restrict her to say, hey, you've been knocked out multiple times. You shouldn't be coming into this next fight to basically put yourself in bigger risk. And she decided to do that. So it's granted, she put herself in that position to be a risk, liability, not only for herself, but for her family that could very well come in and say, hey, why did our child come in to this fight and nobody didn't screen her to say, hey, you shouldn't be fighting. You should be put on some sort of suspension to make sure that you're healed up so your body doesn't take any unnecessary damage. And I get it, boxing is still dangerous, overall. And, I will say, that's not the same thing that happens in wrestling too. It's not something that you can just say, any fighter or any wrestler can just get out clean, for any match that they get into, because, one, one little mistake can easily cost you to be brutally injured or to potentially die. So the thing about this is that this is poor commission procedures that was done, and I'm not going to put the blame on Jocelyn because she'd had nothing to do with this, but I will say she's not known to be a knockout puncher. And same thing with Perla. Both of those fighters are not really knockout punchers. They throw volume punching power, but it's like that the KOs that most of these women really have are usually just very very early or very nonsensical referee stoppages that don't really they don't really constitute as like a real knockout victory. Because if the fighter is getting hit with with like a good few shots here and there, but they're still blocking, but they're throwing maybe like one or two shots back at that other fighter, that doesn't constitute a referee to say I need to stop the fight because you're getting hit with 3-4 punch combinations. But if they're not flush and you're still keeping your hands up, it shouldn't be considered as a TKO. But to those to those type of referees that want to think like that because they think women probably take more damage compared to men, they hold a double standard for those females that are able to take shots, but they're able to be smart to be like, okay, I might take one round off to to basically garner like my stamina back up. But just because that they're probably not throwing as much does not mean you should it doesn't mean that a referee should be able to stop the fight because because one female fighter is just like applying more pressure to the other female fighter simply because the pressure is quote unquote making it seem like that female fighter should be able to get a TKO off of that particular fighter. So I don't think that makes any sense. I think it's a very it's very, how should I say it, illogical, and it's nonsensical. But I do understand the health and safety for fighters to be protected, but there should be a certain standard into proper refereeing to make sure that, okay, if a female or a male fighter gets hit with a big shot and they don't properly recover after they get hit with a big power shot, and let's just say they get punched out with a good 3 to 4 punch combo, and they did not use any defense, they did not tie up, they did not do anything to make sure that they can keep themselves safe from not being flagged off with a TKO loss, then I think that should still be legal. It should still go on if the fighter that's hurt is able to use some form of boxing IQ to hold, to be like, okay, I got clipped, I need to hold. And therefore, if that fighter is still able to still fight on, then yeah, there's nothing wrong. Now, if the fighter is showing any signs of okay, I'm about to pass out, or I'm not really reacting properly to one punch, and therefore they're showing to you to be like, okay, yeah, man, something's wrong, then yeah, the referee should stop in to be like, okay, fight's over, there's something wrong. But on top of that, what should also happen is that you should have a medical, team to be, actively ready to be like, okay, if the fighter's hurt, there should be oxygen ready for the fighter if they got knocked out brutally. Or it's more like, if that fighter doesn't feel, okay, at least try to give them some fluids to make sure that they're being hydrated, or just, anything to kind of keep their body nice and stabilized. So I think personally for me, when it comes to the medical issues in boxing, where if a boxer gets knocked out, there should be certain standards put in place where medical teams should understand what's what should be properly adjudicated to make sure that fighters' health and safety are to be managed a certain type of way to prevent any further damage to their health that could possibly lead to their death. But I mean, if you go if you want to take a look at fights like Gerald McClellan versus Nigel Benn, that fight should have been waved off to the point where it like how should I say it? Like if Gerald knew that something was wrong with his body and he wasn't able to properly react to certain punches, there should have been a proper medical team at that fight to say, hey, Gerald, he looks to be hurt. We gotta wave this off. Like it doesn't seem like that he's taking punches, like effectively. And granted, even though that, like as much as I don't like Nigel Benn because, he has like a history of fighting dirty and, he is to be speculated as a, cheater. I just think that for situations like that, that can very well come back into the sport, and fighters have died from stuff like that, where fighters get hit with rabid punches and therefore they don't properly recover, and then they could very well pass away. That is a big problem. So, I mean, personally for me, man, I just want to see better, officiating for the sport. And for this situation, I think Isis, she should have never been able to fight for at least maybe like a good year, or maybe I'd probably say close to 6 months. I'd probably say at least like a year. I think, if certain commissions want to suspend fighters to make sure that they're properly healthy coming into their next fight after they've been knocked out, or they've been taking damage too much, it should be at least up to like a full year. Like, let's just say if they've been knocked out, they gotta basically stay out for at least like a full year so their body can rest, and their brain isn't taking all that unnecessary punishment. So I mean, that's pretty much what I have to say. I mean, honestly, man, she could have easily died, but I'm just happy, that she's able to, properly recover while she's in her coma and she's able to talk. But, anything could be subject to change. It's not like that just because that she's able to, regain her senses, and she's able to regain her bearings, doesn't mean that she's going to be, physically and mentally the same. So I would hope she's not disabled. I would hope that she doesn't pass away off of some long-term effect that could possibly, affect her to pass away. I would hope that she can properly recover and she could be healed. But, as it always has been, as it always has been said, you don't play boxing and, you don't play wrestling, man. For those of you that may not know, I used to wrestle, but oh crap. I used to wrestle, back in high school, and I always how should I say, remember, seeing wrestlers that get hurt real bad. And, there's been situations where certain kids, that I've grown up with, or, certain, particular matches that I have seen in certain teams, that I've competed up against, there's plenty of near fatal situations where guys can pass out and they can easily, pass away by getting slammed, hard, on the mat. And how should I say, there's plenty of other situations where, many, how should I say, there's always many opportunities for, wrestlers to get hurt with very simple, how should I say, simple, opportunities for them to get brutally injured. And, not a lot of people ever tend to see that, because it's more like, just because it's wrestling and, you don't take blows compared to boxing. No, you can easily die from, brain injury. You could die from spinal damage. You could also die from a lot of, how should I say, CTE. And I think also, you can also suffer damages with your arteries. So I mean, there's plenty of long-term, long-term serious serious driven fatal injuries that can easily take how should I say any potential life of any particular situation in a wrestling match. So that's why similar to boxing, it's always important to be defensively responsible, and don't put yourself how should I say in a position where you're having to basically where you're having to risk yourself more damage for something that is not to be necessary in the first place. So I mean, good enough, like I never put myself in that position, but I have been in situations where I've been slammed real hard, on the mat by dudes that were trying to come in and trying to take me down, but I managed to have a pretty good durability because I competed at the heavyweight divisional weight class, so I did a pretty good job. I mean, I was 27-3, but still, I mean, compared to boxing, I mean, it's the it's the same thing where you have to really focus on your fundamentals and focus on your defense, because one particular punch can very well change your whole career, and that can very well falter everything out of your health. So it's always important to focus on defense, and don't let any situation get out of hand where your health can very well be compromised, and you can very well deal with a massive serious injury that can lead to your death. But I was gonna say, I think another thing that boxers should probably do after their fights is that they should probably go directly to the doctor to make sure that everything is checked out. And I want to say more fighters should probably get into taking certain medicines to probably heal with their how should I say, maybe brain cells, maybe with maybe with taking stem cell medicine, or maybe doing certain supplements that could possibly help them properly recover from taking a lot of damage in their fights. So I just think for stuff like that, that should be implemented more, so therefore fighters can have longer longevity, and they're not having to to how should I say suffer in in a lot of difficult matches that can very well hinder their their performance and their progress as a fighter. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoy this. I have nothing up against Jocelyn. She did what she wanted to do to to be successful, but granted, this could happen to any fighter. That's why it's always important in boxing to use your jab, use your defense, and move your head, man, because one little punch can easily take everything from you. And we've seen it so many times in boxing. So I think the double standards in the sport, where people want to use certain fighters to say, oh well, this fighter they got brutally injured in their fight, and people need to care about this fighter, but compared to other fighters that have suffered a lot worse in fights that were far more competitive, but they were also dirty fights. I mean, nobody doesn't hold that same particular energy for for fighters that have been cheated, or fighters that have been in tougher fights where no one cared from the beginning to hold any particular accountability for commissions or even corrupt how should I say bad actors, whether that's referees not doing their job, or just people in a general not not doing their job through the through the medical commission process to make sure that fighters are are to be cleared effectively before heading into their next upcoming fights. So yeah, I think boxing needs to do a lot better And the stupid fans that that want to play double standard for that, they need to be how should I say, disrespected for that. And all fighters need to be held like accountable for their actions if they if they try to cheat like another like opponent, whether that's doing drug cheating or they're obviously tampering with gloves where they could easily take a fighter's life by cheating. I think that should be a crime, if if any fighter does that, to be legally prosecuted for that. But for the most part, the most important thing in boxing should be there needs to be better, medical like attention, process to make sure that fighters are being given the proper medical like equipment to be used for their recovery, to make sure that if they are getting knocked out, there should be a proper medical team put in place to make sure that they're getting oxygen, given to them, while they're trying to recover from a brutal knockout loss or anything like that. I mean, stuff like that needs to be put into the sport. There needs to be better medicine to be implemented for for fighters, so therefore they can properly recover. So I mean, that's pretty much what I have to say. I mean, I have nothing up against Jocelyn, and I know that she was saying everything like about her particular point of view to be like, well, I want to say that she felt guilty as far as her getting the victory. And I did make I did make a short video on my YouTube and my Instagram talking about this fight where I just can't certify the victory per se, because this isn't something to just feel happy about. But personally, for my point of view, I just don't think it's something that I can really say that's a real victory, because it's if the fighter themselves was not able to properly respond to just one punch that was out of their control, where they got knocked out brutally to the point where they weren't able to be medically fit for the fight to begin with, then I usually slide those fights to not really be considered victories. Because if that fighter was going through a process where they've been knocked out multiple times heading into the fight that they were previously in, leading into the next fight, then I just think that's just something that needs to be put with that has to be I should say labeled with a question mark, to be there's something that had happened behind closed doors that people aren't talking about, and it should be further investigated with. So yeah, I hope heading into the future, Isis, if she's able to still compete in boxing, I would still like to see her fight. But if not, she should just go ahead and move on with her life. She's 19 years old, and I wish her nothing nothing but the best. I do believe that she did say in local news stations where she's been interviewed in the past that she is a business owner. So I think she owns her own gym and she has other businesses. So I would say, if anything, she should probably go ahead and just focus on that. If boxing's not for her, where she's not able to properly sustain the punishment for her to be in the sport. So personally for me, I think she should just go ahead and just move on. If anything, if she wants to still continue in boxing, she could probably just focus on being a trainer. I mean, there's always opportunities for that. Or if anything, why not just be your own promoter? So yeah, hopefully she she continues to to do what she does, and I wish her nothing but the best. And same thing for Jocelyn Camarillo. I hope she continues to get more good victories in her boxing career. And I hope fewer situations don't arise from this particular fatal tragedy, or near fatal tragedy. So yeah, I have nothing up against her, man. So I hope she's doing okay. And I mean, stuff like this is crazy, man. Like, like it's definitely one thing to see it on a TV, but if you see it up close where somebody could very well die, that's a really big deal, man. I mean, look at Subriel Matias when he killed Maxim Dadashev. I mean, granted, that was a fight that Maxim Dadashev, he took a lot of damage and he wasn't coming into that fight with any defense, but still, there was still like a lot of like I should say punches that he was throwing to Subriel Matias, and it was like a back and forth fight where either fighter could have been stopped, but still, it's more to do with like you have to really use defense to the point of actually making that your normal routine to be successful. Because if you don't use defense, then you will never get to the top to be to where you're at. So yeah, that's pretty much it, man. I hope you guys enjoyed it, but yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say, man. Like, I'm hoping ISIS is doing okay, and yeah, that's pretty much it, man. So shout out to her, and like I wish her nothing but nothing but the best, and same thing to Jocelyn Camarillo. There's nothing for her to feel guilty for her. Well, more so, there's nothing to be feel like to feel any particular means of feeling how should I say psychologically how should I say psychologically shocked of going through any situation like that. So like I hope fewer situations can occur, and there needs to be better accountability in the sport of boxing, for stuff like this. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's my 2 cents, and I will catch you guys later. And be sure to like, rate, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you guys. All right, I'll see you guys, and peace.